The words hit me like a slap across the face at what should have been a pleasant family dinner. Tell me, what did you do with the $300,000 I gave you? My fork froze halfway to my mouth, loaded with Diana's famous pot roast. I set it down slowly, my mind scrambling to make sense of what my millionaire son had just asked me. $300,000? What do you mean, Thomas? The confusion in my voice was genuine, but apparently not convincing enough for the woman sitting across from me. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. Diana's face had gone from its usual perfectly composed mask to an alarming shade of pale. Her manicured fingers gripped her wine glass so tightly, I thought it might shatter. The silence stretched between us like a taut wire, broken only by the soft jazz playing from their expensive sound system and the gentle clink of Sophie and Michael's forks as my teenage grandchildren continued eating, blissfully unaware that their family dinner had just taken a devastating turn. Let me back up and tell you how we got to this moment, because 30 minutes ago, everything seemed normal. Well, as normal as things ever got in the Thompson household. I'd arrived at 6 sharp, just like Diana preferred, carrying my usual contribution of homemade dinner rolls that Thomas had loved since childhood. The sprawling colonial in Westchester looked as pristine as ever, all marble countertops and fresh flowers that probably cost more than my monthly Social Security check. Diana had greeted me with her standard air kisses and that smile that never quite reached her eyes. "Margaret, you look lovely," she'd said, though we both knew my department store cardigan didn't exactly match her designer aesthetic. "Thomas is just finishing up a call in his office. Some big merger thing." She'd waved her hand dismissively, as if millions of dollars were just monopoly money. Thomas had appeared 15 minutes later, still radiating that high-powered executive energy that had made him wealthy beyond my wildest dreams. At 42, my son had everything I'd wanted for him growing up in our modest 2-bedroom apartment after his father died. Success, security, a beautiful family. So why did he look so troubled? "Sorry about that," he'd said, kissing my cheek. "Crisis at the Singapore office." We'd made small talk over cocktails, the usual updates about the kids' activities and Diana's charity work. Sophie was applying to colleges. Michael had made varsity soccer. Normal family conversation that felt increasingly strained as the evening progressed. Now, sitting in their elegant dining room with its crystal chandelier casting warm light over the mahogany table, I realized something had been building toward this moment. The way Diana kept fidgeting with her jewelry, the way Thomas kept checking his phone, the way they'd exchanged those loaded glances when they thought I wasn't looking. "Mom," Thomas said, his voice taking on that patient tone he used in business meetings. "6 months ago, I transferred $300,000 to your account. We discussed it over lunch at that little cafe you like. You said you wanted to help Sophie with college expenses and maybe do some traveling." He pulled out his phone, scrolling through what looked like banking records. "I have the confirmation right here." My stomach dropped to somewhere around my ankles. 6 months ago, Thomas had indeed taken me to lunch at Rossetti's, my favorite Italian place. We'd talked about Sophie's college plans, about how proud I was of both grandchildren, about how I wished I could contribute more to their futures on my fixed income. But he'd never mentioned giving me money. Not $300, let alone $300,000. "Thomas, sweetheart," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I think there's been some mistake. You never gave me any money. And trust me, I would remember $300,000. I attempted a laugh, but it came out shaky and uncertain. Diana's wine glass slipped from her fingers, shattering against the marble floor in an explosion of crystal and red wine that looked disturbingly like blood. "Oh my God!" she gasped, diving down to clean up the mess with shaking hands. "I'm so sorry. I'm so clumsy tonight." Thomas stared at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not anger exactly, but something colder, more calculating. "Mom, I need you to be very careful about what you say next. There are federal investigators looking into some irregularities in my business accounts. Money that was transferred but never reached its intended destinations." His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "If you've done something with that money, if you've invested it or hidden it somewhere, you need to tell me right now before this gets worse." Federal investigators. The room started spinning slightly, and I gripped the edge of the table to steady myself. Thomas, I swear to you, I have never received any money from you. Check my bank statements. Look at my apartment. Do I look like someone who has $300,000 hidden somewhere? That's when we heard the sirens. Diana's face went from pale to ash gray as the sound grew closer, then stopped right outside. Thomas stood up so quickly his chair tipped backward. "They're early," he muttered, more to himself than to us. "Who's early?" I demanded. But I already knew the answer was about to walk through that front door. The doorbell rang, followed immediately by heavy knocking. "Mr. Thompson, FBI, we need to speak with you and your family." The FBI agents were exactly what you'd expect from a television show, except scarier because they were standing in my son's foyer, holding badges and wearing expressions that meant business. Agent Sarah Martinez was probably my age, but carried herself with the kind of authority that made everyone in the room shrink back slightly. Her partner, Agent James Chen, looked like he could bench press a small car. "Mr. Thompson, we appreciate your cooperation," Agent Martinez said, settling into one of Diana's pristine white chairs like she owned the place. "As we discussed on the phone, we're investigating several financial irregularities connected to your business accounts. Money that was transferred out but seems to have vanished into thin air." I caught the phrase, "as we discussed on the phone," and felt another piece of the puzzle click into place. Thomas had known they were coming. He'd arranged this dinner, this confrontation about the missing money, knowing the FBI would show up. My own son had set me up. "Now, Mrs. Thompson," Agent Martinez turned her attention to me. "Your son claims he transferred $300,000 to your account 6 months ago. Our records show the money left his business account, but it never appeared in any account registered under your name or social security number." I straightened in my chair, channeling every ounce of dignity I'd learned in 68 years of life. "Agent Martinez, I can provide you with every bank statement, every financial record I have. I'm a widow, living on Social Security and a small pension from the school district where I worked for 30 years. If I had $300,000, I certainly wouldn't be clipping coupons and shopping at discount stores." Agent Chen leaned forward. "Mrs. Thompson, money laundering is a federal crime. If you've helped hide or move funds to avoid taxation or investigation, the penalties are severe regardless of your age or circumstances." "I haven't laundered anything except my sheets," I said, and immediately regretted the sarcasm. This wasn't the time for jokes, even if the situation felt surreal. "I'm sorry, I'm just trying to understand how I became involved in something I know nothing about." Agent Martinez consulted her notes. "The transfer was initiated from your son's business account on March 15th. The receiving account was registered under the name Margaret Thompson, with the last 4 digits of your social security number. But the account was opened using an address in Millbrook, not your current residence in White Plains." Millbrook. My heart started racing for a different reason now. Diana's sister lived in Millbrook. Diana had grown up there, still had connections, still talked about the quaint shops and farmers market every time we visited. It was 30 minutes from where we sat, close enough to be convenient, far enough to avoid scrutiny. I glanced at Diana, who had been unusually quiet since the agents arrived. She was sitting perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, but I could see a small muscle ticking in her jaw, the same nervous tell she'd had since marrying Thomas 12 years ago, usually when the monthly credit card bills arrived. "Diana," I said slowly, watching her face carefully, "didn't you mention opening a savings account for the kids' future? Something about getting better interest rates at that small bank in Millbrook?" Thomas looked confused. "What savings account?" "Diana, we keep everything at First National." Diana's composure cracked just slightly. "I might have mentioned looking into options. Interest rates vary so much between banks." Her voice sounded strained, like she was forcing the words out. Agent Chen made a note. "Mrs. Diana Thompson, are you authorized to conduct financial business using your mother-in-law's personal information?" The question hung in the air like a sword about to drop. Diana opened her mouth, closed it, then opened it again. "I would never— that would be identity theft. Why would you even suggest such a thing?" But I was remembering things now. How Diana always insisted on handling the family's paperwork because she was more organized. How she'd offered to help me set up online banking after Robert died. How she'd asked for copies of my important documents for emergencies. How she'd somehow known my social security number when the kids' school needed it for some grandparents' day registration. "Agent Martinez," I said, "I think you need to look very carefully at who actually opened that account in Millbrook, and more importantly, who's been accessing it." Thomas stared at his wife with dawning horror. "Diana, tell me you didn't." Diana stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "This is ridiculous. I'm not going to sit here and be accused of crimes I didn't commit. Margaret, I can't believe you're throwing your own family under the bus to save yourself." The accusation was so backwards, so completely opposite to what was actually happening, that I almost laughed. Diana was trying to flip the script, make me the villain in a story where she'd stolen money using my identity. But before I could respond, Agent Martinez dropped the bombshell that changed everything. "Mrs. Diana Thompson, we have security footage from the Millbrook Community Bank showing you making deposits and withdrawals from the account in question. We also have copies of the identification you used, which appears to be a fraudulent driver's license bearing Mrs. Margaret Thompson's name, but your photograph." The silence that followed was so complete, I could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway. Diana's face went through a series of expressions like she was cycling through different lies, trying to find one that would stick. Thomas looked like he'd been hit with a sledgehammer. "That's impossible," Diana whispered. "You must be mistaken." Agent Chen pulled out a tablet and swiped to a video file. "March 18th, 3 days after the initial transfer. You deposited the funds and immediately wrote 3 checks. One to Premier Properties for $50,000, one to Diana Thompson Designs for $200,000, and one cash withdrawal for $50,000. Diana Thompson Designs. I'd never heard of that business before, but judging by Thomas's expression, he had, and he wasn't happy about it. That's when I realized this story was about to get much more complicated than anyone in that room was prepared for. Thomas's voice was deadly quiet when he spoke. "Diana Thompson Designs? What is Diana Thompson Designs?" The way he said his wife's name made it sound like a curse word. Diana had gone completely still, like a deer caught in headlights. But I could practically see her mind racing behind those perfectly made-up eyes. She was calculating, trying to figure out which lie would cause the least damage. Agent Martinez consulted her tablet again. "Diana Thompson Designs appears to be a limited liability company registered in Delaware 6 months ago. The registered address is a P.O. box in Millbrook, and the sole proprietor is listed as Diana Thompson." She looked up at my daughter-in-law with the kind of expression that suggested she'd seen this type of financial maneuvering before. "It appears to be a consulting business for interior design services." Consulting business? Thomas stood up so fast, his chair toppled backward. "Diana, you don't have a consulting business. You don't work. You haven't worked since Sophie was born." His voice was rising, and I could see 17-year-old Sophie in the kitchen doorway, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. Sophie had always been my favorite, not that grandmothers are supposed to have favorites. But she reminded me so much of Thomas at that age, curious and intelligent with a sense of justice that sometimes got her in trouble at school. Right now, she looked like her world was crumbling, which I realized it probably was. "Maybe the kids should go upstairs," I suggested gently, trying to provide some normalcy in a situation that had gone completely off the rails. "No," Thomas said firmly. "They're old enough to understand that their mother is apparently a criminal." Diana's mask finally slipped completely. "Don't you dare talk to me like that in front of my children. I did this for us, for our family's future. Do you have any idea how precarious our situation really is?" "Precarious?" Thomas's voice cracked on the word. "Diana, I make over $2 million a year. We live in a house worth $3 million. How is that precarious?" Agent Chen cleared his throat. "Mr. Thompson, our investigation suggests that your wife has been systematically moving money from various accounts over the past 18 months. The $300,000 in question was just the most recent transaction. I felt like I was watching a movie where the plot kept twisting in directions I never saw coming. Diana hadn't just stolen money from me. She'd been stealing from her own family for over a year, and she'd used my identity to do it." "Various accounts?" Thomas's face had gone pale. "What other accounts?" Diana finally seemed to realize that her situation was hopeless. Her perfect posture sagged, and she sank back into her chair like a deflated balloon. The college funds, Sophie's and Michael's college funds, some of the business reserves, the emergency account. Each admission came out quieter than the last. How much? Thomas's voice was barely a whisper. Agent Martinez answered instead. Our preliminary investigation shows approximately $1.2 million moved through fraudulent accounts over the past 18 months. $1.2 million. I couldn't even wrap my mind around that number. I'd worked for 30 years as a school secretary and never made more than $40,000 in any single year. Diana had stolen more money than I could earn in multiple lifetimes. But the most shocking part was what she'd done with it. Premier Properties, I said, remembering the check Agent Chen had mentioned. That was one of the companies she wrote a check to. What is Premier Properties? Agent Chen swiped through his notes. Premier Properties is a real estate investment company based in Miami. They specialize in luxury vacation rentals in the Florida Keys. Thomas stared at his wife with an expression I'd never seen before. Pure, undiluted betrayal. You bought property in Florida? With stolen money? It's not stolen. Diana's voice rose to nearly a shriek. It's our money, your money. I was investing it, growing it for our retirement. Those properties in the Keys are going to triple in value over the next 10 years. Using my mother's identity. Opening fraudulent accounts. Diana, this is federal fraud, not some risky investment strategy. I'd been quiet through most of this exchange, trying to process the magnitude of what Diana had done. She'd used my name, my social security number, my entire identity to create a financial house of cards that was now collapsing around all of us. But there was something else bothering me, something that didn't quite add up. Diana, I said, my voice cutting through their argument, how did you know the FBI was coming tonight? Everyone turned to look at me. Agent Martinez raised an eyebrow, clearly interested in my question. What do you mean? Diana asked, but I could see panic flickering in her eyes. Thomas said the agents were early. That means you knew they were coming. You arranged this dinner, this confrontation about the money, knowing that federal investigators would show up. You were trying to make me look guilty. The room went dead silent. Even Sophie, who was still hovering in the kitchen doorway, seemed to understand the significance of what I'd just said. Thomas looked from me to his wife, the pieces falling into place. Diana, did you know about the investigation? Diana's hands were shaking now, really shaking. I got a call from someone at the bank. They said there were questions about some accounts, that investigators might want to talk to us. I thought if we could just explain about the money, if we could show it was a family transaction. You were going to let me take the blame, I said, and it wasn't a question. You stole over $1 million using my identity, and you were going to sit there and let me go to federal prison for it. You don't understand! Diana was crying now, mascara running down her cheeks in dark streams. Thomas's business is struggling. The Singapore deal fell through, the merger collapsed, we're leveraged up to our eyeballs. I was trying to save us. Thomas went very, very still. What do you mean my business is struggling? Diana, what do you know about my business that I don't? That's when Agent Martinez stood up, and I knew we were about to learn that this rabbit hole went much deeper than any of us had imagined. Agent Martinez's expression shifted from professional interest to something much more serious. Mr. Thompson, are you saying you're not aware of the financial irregularities in your own company? Thomas looked genuinely confused, which should have been reassuring but somehow made everything feel more ominous. What irregularities? My CFO handles the day-to-day finances, but I review all major transactions. Everything's been normal. Your CFO? Agent Chen consulted his notes. That would be David Morrison? Yes, Dave's been with the company for 8 years. He's completely trustworthy. But even as Thomas said it, I could see doubt creeping into his expression. After discovering his wife's betrayal, his faith in people's trustworthiness had probably taken a serious hit. Agent Martinez pulled out another tablet. Mr. Morrison contacted our office 3 weeks ago. He's the one who reported the discrepancies in the company accounts. According to his statement, someone with high-level access has been systematically transferring funds from various business accounts into personal accounts for almost 2 years. The color drained from Thomas's face. That's impossible. Only 3 people have that level of access. Me, Dave, and... He stopped, staring at his wife with dawning horror. And Diana Thompson, Agent Chen finished, who was added as an authorized signatory on the business accounts 14 months ago. I watched my daughter-in-law's face cycle through surprise, panic, and finally a kind of desperate calculation. She was still looking for an angle, still trying to figure out how to manipulate the situation to her advantage. It was fascinating and terrifying to watch someone's true nature reveal itself in real time. Thomas needed help managing everything, Diana said, her voice taking on that honey-sweet tone she used when she was trying to get her way. You were working such long hours, dealing with the Singapore expansion. I was just trying to help, to take some of the administrative burden off your shoulders. By stealing from the business? Thomas's voice was hollow, like he was speaking from the bottom of a well. Diana, do you understand what you've done? This isn't just fraud, it's embezzlement. You could go to prison for decades. Agent Martinez cleared her throat. Actually, given the amounts involved and the sophisticated nature of the fraud, we're looking at potential sentences of 20 to 30 years. Plus restitution, which based on our current calculations, could exceed $2 million. $2 million. I felt sick thinking about it. Diana had destroyed her family's entire financial future, and she'd tried to drag me down with her. But there was still something bothering me about the timeline. 14 months, I said, thinking out loud. Diana, you were added to the business accounts 14 months ago, but you've been moving money for 18 months. How does that work? Agent Chen flipped through his files. The earliest fraudulent activity we've traced involved the children's college funds, which are held in accounts that both parents have access to. The business accounts came later, as the amounts increased and she needed more sophisticated methods to hide the transfers. Sophie, who had been silent through most of this nightmare, finally spoke up. Mom, you stole our college money? Her voice was small, broken, and it hit me harder than all the talk of federal crimes and prison sentences. Diana turned to her daughter with tears streaming down her face. Sophie, honey, I was going to replace it all. The Florida properties, they're going to be worth so much more. I was securing our future. By destroying our present, Michael said, appearing beside his sister. At 15, he looked older than his years, and the betrayal in his eyes was heartbreaking. Mom, Grandma Margaret could have gone to prison. You were going to let her go to prison for something she didn't do. That's when I realized something that made my blood run cold. Diana, you would have let me take the blame. But what about the business fraud? How were you planning to explain that? Diana looked like a cornered animal. I was going to say I thought I had permission, that Thomas had asked me to move money between accounts for tax purposes. I would have played dumb, said I didn't understand the implications. Thomas made a sound like he'd been punched in the stomach. You were going to destroy my reputation, my business, my relationships with every client and partner I've built over 20 years. Diana, I could lose my licenses, my certifications. I could be prosecuted as an accessory. It wouldn't have come to that, Diana said desperately. I had it all planned out. We would have paid everything back with interest from the Florida investments. No one would have been hurt. Agent Martinez stood up. Mrs. Thompson, we need you to come with us for questioning. You have the right to remain silent. As Agent Martinez began reading Diana her rights, I found myself thinking about how this entire nightmare had started with a simple question about money. Diana's crime wasn't just financial, it was personal. She'd stolen my identity, my good name, my relationship with my family. She'd been willing to let me take the blame for her crimes, to watch me go to prison, to protect herself. But as I watched the FBI agents escort my daughter-in-law out of the house she'd bought with stolen money, I realized something else. Diana had made one crucial mistake in her elaborate scheme. She'd underestimated her victim. She'd thought I was just a harmless old woman who would be easy to frame, too confused and overwhelmed to fight back effectively. She'd forgotten that I'd raised Thomas as a single mother after his father died, working 2 jobs and going to night school to get my degree. She'd forgotten that I'd spent 30 years working in a school system, dealing with budget crises and administrative politics, and parents who tried to manipulate the system for their children's benefit. She'd forgotten that I was a survivor. And now, as the reality of what she'd done settled over the house like a dark cloud, I realized that surviving this was going to require every ounce of strength and wisdom I'd gained in 68 years of life, because the real fight was just beginning. The house felt like a tomb after the FBI agents left with Diana. Thomas sat at his kitchen table staring at a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, while Sophie and Michael huddled together on the living room sofa, whispering in the way teenagers do when their world has just imploded. I'd sent them to pack overnight bags. They'd be staying with me while we figured out what came next. I should have known, Thomas kept saying, over and over, like a broken record. The signs were all there. How could I have been so blind? I wanted to comfort him, to tell him that love makes us vulnerable to deception, that trusting your spouse isn't a character flaw. But honestly, I was still processing my own anger. Diana had been willing to let me go to federal prison to protect herself. That level of calculated cruelty was hard to forgive, even for someone who'd been part of our family for 12 years. Thomas, I said gently, settling into the chair across from him, beating yourself up won't solve anything. We need to focus on damage control. He looked up at me with eyes that seemed older than they had been this morning. Damage control? Mom, do you understand what this means? The business investigation could destroy everything I've worked for. Even if I'm not charged with anything, the scandal alone could ruin my reputation. Clients don't want to work with someone whose wife is a federal criminal. I'd been thinking about that during the long hour after Diana was taken away. Have you talked to Dave Morrison recently? Your CFO? Not since he called about some accounting discrepancies last month. Why? Because he's the one who reported the fraud to the FBI. Thomas, Dave Morrison is trying to save your company. He saw what Diana was doing and took action to protect you. Thomas blinked at me like he was seeing me clearly for the first time all evening. You think Dave knew it was Diana? I think Dave knew someone with high-level access was stealing from the business, and he chose to report it to federal authorities rather than handle it internally. That suggests he was trying to establish a clear record that you weren't involved. My phone buzzed with a text message from a number I didn't recognize. Mrs. Thompson, this is Agent Martinez. We'll need to speak with you tomorrow about pressing charges for identity theft. Please call our office in the morning. Identity theft. Just seeing the words made my stomach clench. Diana hadn't just stolen money, she'd stolen my entire identity to commit federal crimes. My name was on fraudulent accounts, fake identification documents, business registrations I'd never authorized. Even though I was a victim, untangling this mess was going to take months, maybe years. Mom, Thomas said, noticing my expression. What is it? I showed him the text. I have to decide whether to press charges against Diana for identity theft. Of course you're pressing charges. She tried to frame you for federal crimes. But it wasn't that simple. And we both knew it. Diana was still the mother of my grandchildren. Sophie and Michael had already lost their college funds and their sense of security. Did they need to watch their mother go to prison for even longer because of additional charges? Sophie appeared in the kitchen doorway, her overnight bag slung over her shoulder. Grandma Margaret, are you going to send Mom to prison? The question hit me like a physical blow. How do you explain to a 17-year-old that her mother is a criminal who was willing to let her grandmother take the blame for her crimes? Sophie, honey, your mother made some very serious choices that hurt a lot of people. There are consequences for those choices. But you could choose not to press charges, right? Sophie's eyes were red from crying, but her voice was steady. You could just let the FBI handle the business stuff and not make it worse. Michael joined his sister in the doorway. Sophie, Mom stole Grandma's identity. She was going to let Grandma go to prison. How is that not worse? I looked at these two kids, caught in the middle of an adult disaster they had no part in creating, and felt my heart break a little more. But then I thought about what Diana had done, the calculated cruelty of it, the months of planning required to execute such an elaborate fraud. I need some time to think about it, I said finally. Thomas walked the kids out to my car, loading their bags into the trunk while I gathered my purse and coat. As I was heading for the door, my phone rang. The caller ID showed Diana's sister, Patricia. Margaret, thank God. Patricia's voice was frantic. I just heard what happened. Diana called me from the FBI office. She says this is all a misunderstanding, that Thomas is trying to frame her for his business problems. Even from jail, Diana was still spinning lies, still trying to manipulate the narrative. Patricia, Diana stole over $2 million using fraudulent accounts opened with my identity. The FBI has security footage and documentation. There's no misunderstanding. But she's my sister, Margaret. She's got 2 children. Surely you can work something out, family to family, family to family. The irony was almost funny. Diana had been willing to destroy our family to protect herself, but now I was supposed to show family loyalty to save her. Patricia, Diana made her choices. Now she has to live with the consequences. After I hung up, I stood in Thomas's foyer looking around at the house Diana had filled with expensive furniture and artwork, paid for with stolen money. Everything here was tainted now, built on a foundation of lies and theft. But as I walked to my car where Sophie and Michael were waiting, I realized something important. Diana's crimes had revealed something ugly about human nature, but they'd also revealed something beautiful. Thomas's business partner had risked his own career to report the fraud. My grandchildren were more concerned about doing the right thing than protecting their mother from consequences. Thomas himself, despite his shock and betrayal, was already thinking about how to rebuild. Diana had tried to destroy our family with her greed and deception. But families, real families, are stronger than the worst thing any one member can do. Tomorrow, I would call Agent Martinez and press charges for identity theft, not out of revenge, but because some lines can't be crossed without consequences. Because Sophie and Michael needed to see that actions have results, that justice matters, that their grandmother was strong enough to fight for what's right even when it's painful. Diana had made the mistake of thinking I was weak, that I would be easy to victimize and discard. She was about to learn just how wrong she'd been. I woke up the next morning in my own apartment with Sophie asleep on my sofa and Michael camped out in sleeping bags on the floor. My small 2-bedroom place had never felt more like home than it did watching my grandchildren find comfort in my simple, honest space after the palace of lies they'd been living in. The coffee was brewing when my phone rang at 7:30. Thomas, sounding like he hadn't slept at all. "Mom, I've been up all night thinking about what Diana said. About the business being in trouble. I called Dave Morrison at home. We're meeting at 8 to go through everything." "That's smart, sweetheart. You need to know exactly what you're dealing with. There's something else. I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about Diana planning this dinner, knowing the FBI was coming." "Mom, I think she's been planning this for a lot longer than we realized." I poured my coffee, settling into my kitchen chair with the phone pressed to my ear. "What do you mean? Remember last Christmas when she insisted on updating all our emergency contacts and beneficiary information? She said it was just good estate planning, making sure everything was current. But she had copies of your social security card, your birth certificate, all your personal documents." The memory hit me like ice water. Diana had been so helpful, so organized, making copies of everything for the family files. I'd been grateful for her efficiency. Instead, I'd been handing her everything she needed to steal my identity. "Thomas, she was planning this for at least a year. This wasn't some desperate reaction to financial pressure. This was a long-term strategy." "Jesus, Mom, who does that? Who plans to frame their own mother-in-law for federal crimes? Someone who saw me as disposable," I thought. Someone who viewed family relationships as tools to be used rather than bonds to be cherished. But I didn't say that to Thomas. He was hurt enough already. "Have you heard from her since yesterday?" "Her lawyer called this morning. She's been released on bond, staying with Patricia. The lawyer wants to set up a meeting to discuss resolution options." Resolution options. Even through lawyers, Diana was still trying to manipulate the situation, looking for ways to minimize consequences and shift blame. "Thomas, whatever her lawyer proposes, remember that Diana committed federal crimes using my identity. I'm not interested in resolution. I'm interested in justice." After we hung up, I sat in my kitchen listening to my grandchildren sleeping and thinking about the woman who had lived in our family for 12 years. I'd never loved Diana exactly, but I'd respected her as Thomas's choice, as the mother of my grandchildren. I'd tried to build a relationship with her, to be the kind of mother-in-law who was helpful without being intrusive. Looking back now, I could see that Diana had never wanted a relationship with me. She'd wanted access, information, documents, and opportunities. Every kindness I'd extended, every document I'd shared, every piece of personal information I'd given her, she'd cataloged and saved for potential use. My phone rang again. Agent Martinez. Mrs. Thompson, I hope you're prepared for what comes next. Diana Thompson's attorney is claiming that you were aware of the financial arrangements, that you gave permission for the accounts to be opened in your name. I'd been expecting this. Agent Martinez, I have 30 years of financial records showing a modest income and careful budgeting. I have witnesses who can testify to my character and my shock when I learned about the money. And I have documentation showing that Diana systematically collected my personal information over months. That's good. We'll need all of that. But I want you to understand that this is going to be a long process. Diana's crimes were sophisticated and extensive. The investigation alone could take 6 months. 6 months of having my life scrutinized, my finances examined, my reputation questioned. 6 months of court dates and depositions and legal proceedings. 6 months of watching my grandchildren deal with having a mother in federal prison. But as I hung up the phone, I realized I was ready for the fight. Diana had made the mistake of thinking I was weak, that I would crumble under pressure, that I would choose family peace over justice. She'd forgotten that I'd raised Thomas alone after his father died. She'd forgotten that I'd worked 2 jobs while getting my degree, that I'd navigated school board politics and administrative bureaucracy for 30 years. She'd forgotten that I'd survived being widowed at 63 and rebuilt my life from nothing. Diana had tried to make me a victim. Instead, she'd awakened something in me that had been sleeping for too long. She'd reminded me that I was a fighter. My phone buzzed with a text from Thomas. Dave says the business can be saved. Most of the stolen money can be recovered from the Florida properties. We're going to be okay. We were going to be okay. Not because Diana had shown us mercy, but because good people had made hard choices to do the right thing. Dave Morrison had reported the fraud. Thomas was facing the truth about his marriage. Sophie and Michael were choosing justice over convenience. And I was choosing to fight back against someone who had tried to destroy my life. Diana Thompson was about to learn that she'd picked the wrong grandmother to mess with. 3 months into the federal investigation, I thought we'd learned everything there was to know about Diana's crimes. I was wrong. Agent Martinez called me on a Tuesday morning with news that made my blood run cold all over again. Mrs. Thompson, we need you to come in immediately. We've discovered evidence that suggests Diana's criminal network is much larger than we initially understood. 20 minutes later, I was sitting in the FBI field office, staring at surveillance photographs that showed Diana meeting with people I'd never seen before. But what made my stomach drop was recognizing some of the locations where these meetings had taken place. Agent Martinez, this photo was taken at Millbrook Community Bank, and this one is at the restaurant where Patricia suggested we have lunch last month. That's correct. We've been monitoring communications from federal prison, and Diana has been coordinating with accomplices who are still active. The meetings you're seeing happened before her arrest, but the coordination has continued from jail. Agent Chen joined us, carrying what looked like transcripts of phone calls. Mrs. Thompson, Diana has been using her sister Patricia as a go-between to communicate with other members of her criminal network. The phone calls from prison that we thought were just family support have actually been coded instructions. Patricia had been lying to me from the moment Diana was arrested. Every concerned phone call, every offer to help with the grandchildren, every expression of shock about Diana's crimes had been part of an ongoing deception designed to keep me unaware of the continuing threat. What kind of continuing threat? Agent Martinez pulled out more surveillance photos. Diana's network specializes in targeting elderly victims through family relationships. Your case wasn't unique, Mrs. Thompson. Diana and her associates have been systematically identifying and victimizing senior citizens across multiple states for over 15 years. The photos showed elderly people in various locations, apparently unaware they were being watched and documented. Just like the surveillance photos Diana had taken of me, these images showed detailed documentation of daily routines, shopping patterns, and social activities. How many other families has Diana targeted? Based on the evidence we've uncovered, Diana's network has victimized at least 12 families in 6 different states. The methods are always similar: marriage or adoption into the family, gradual collection of personal information, systematic financial fraud, and in several cases, suspicious deaths of elderly family members. Suspicious deaths. Diana hadn't just been planning her first murder with me, she'd potentially been killing elderly victims for over a decade. The scope of her crimes was staggering. Agent Chen opened another file. Mrs. Thompson, we've identified a pattern in Diana's criminal activities that suggests she's been working with the same core group of accomplices for years. Patricia Walsh and Marcus Webb are just the local operatives. The network includes document forgers, financial experts, and what appear to be people who specialize in staging accidents. People who specialized in staging accidents. Diana's plan to make my death look like an accidental fall during my morning walk wasn't something she'd improvised. It was a technique her network had probably used multiple times before. Agent Martinez, why are you telling me this now? Diana's already in federal custody. Because we believe Patricia Walsh and Marcus Webb are continuing to operate while Diana's in prison. They've targeted another elderly victim, and we need your help to stop them. Another elderly victim. Diana's network was still active, still targeting senior citizens for financial fraud and potential murder, even with their leader in federal custody. Agent Martinez pulled out photos of a woman who appeared to be in her 70s, along with surveillance notes that looked identical to the documentation Diana had compiled on me. This is Eleanor Chen, age 74, widow, living alone in Stamford. Patricia Walsh has been cultivating a friendship with her for the past 2 months, using the same methods she used to gather intelligence on you. I stared at the photos of Eleanor Chen, seeing myself in her routine grocery shopping trips and library visits. Patricia was setting up another elderly woman for financial fraud and possible murder, using techniques she'd perfected while spying on me. What do you want me to do? Agent Chen leaned forward. We want you to help us set a trap for Patricia and Marcus. You're the only person who's survived their targeting process and understands how they operate. A trap. The FBI wanted me to help catch Diana's accomplices by using my experience as their intended victim. The idea was both terrifying and oddly satisfying. How would that work? Agent Martinez explained their plan. We want you to contact Patricia and tell her you're having second thoughts about testifying against Diana. Suggest that you're feeling guilty about breaking up the family and that you might be willing to change your testimony. Patricia will never believe I'd helped Diana after learning about the murder plot. Actually, we think she will. Patricia doesn't know that we've discovered the full extent of the conspiracy. She thinks Diana was caught for simple financial fraud, not murder planning. If you approach this as family reconciliation rather than criminal cooperation, Patricia might believe you're genuinely conflicted. The plan made sense, but it also meant putting myself back in contact with people who'd been planning to kill me. The thought of sitting across from Patricia, knowing she'd been paid to spy on me for 18 months, made my skin crawl. Mrs. Thompson, Agent Chen said, we understand this is a lot to ask, but Eleanor Chen is in immediate danger, and you might be the only person who can help us save her life. Eleanor Chen, who probably had no idea she was being stalked and targeted by professional criminals. Just like I'd had no idea for 2 years that Diana was documenting my every move and planning my murder. Agent Martinez, if I do this, what protection do I have? If Patricia realizes I'm working with the FBI, won't she warn the others? We'll have surveillance teams monitoring all your interactions with Patricia. The moment we detect any threat to your safety, we'll intervene. But Mrs. Thompson, Patricia believes you're just a confused elderly woman who got caught up in family drama. She doesn't see you as a threat. Patricia's underestimation of me might be the key to catching her. She'd spent months thinking of me as a vulnerable target rather than a capable adversary. That assumption could be her downfall. All right, I said finally. What do I need to do? Agent Martinez smiled grimly. You need to convince Patricia that you want to help Diana, while secretly helping us gather evidence to stop her entire criminal network. As I left the FBI office, I realized I was about to become a double agent in a war I'd never asked to join. But Eleanor Chen deserved the same protection that Dave Morrison had provided for my family, and I was the only person positioned to provide it. Diana had made the mistake of thinking I was weak and expendable. Patricia was about to make the same mistake. They were both about to learn that this grandmother had more fight in her than they'd ever imagined. The phone call to Patricia felt like stepping back into a nightmare I thought was over. But as I dialed her number, I reminded myself that this wasn't about me anymore. It was about saving Eleanor Chen from the same fate Diana had planned for me. Margaret, I'm so surprised to hear from you. Patricia's voice was warm and concerned, exactly the tone she'd used when she was spying on me for Diana. How are you holding up with everything that's happened? Actually, Patricia, that's why I'm calling. I've been doing a lot of thinking about Diana and the family, and I'm wondering if maybe I've been too harsh. There was a pause on the other end of the line. What do you mean, too harsh? I took a deep breath, channeling the confused and guilt-ridden grandmother that Patricia expected me to be. Well, Diana is still the mother of my grandchildren, and she's your sister. Maybe there was some misunderstanding about the financial arrangements, and I've blown this all out of proportion. Margaret, are you saying you think Diana might be innocent? I'm saying that maybe Thomas and I didn't communicate clearly about family finances, and Diana got caught in the middle. She was probably just trying to help, and now she's in federal prison because of my testimony. Patricia's voice got more animated, more hopeful. Margaret, I've been thinking the same thing. Diana would never intentionally hurt family. There has to be some explanation for what happened that makes sense. I could practically hear Patricia calculating in the background, figuring out how to use my apparent change of heart to help Diana's legal defense. But what she didn't know was that Agent Martinez was listening to every word of our conversation from a van parked outside my building. Patricia, do you think there's any way I could help Diana? Maybe if I talked to her lawyer, explained that I might have been mistaken about some things. Oh, Margaret, that would mean so much to Diana and the children. I know she's been heartbroken thinking you believe she's a criminal. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Patricia eagerly encouraging my apparent reconciliation with Diana while subtly probing for information about what I might be willing to change in my testimony. By the end of the call, we'd arranged to meet for lunch the next day to discuss how I could help with Diana's defense. After I hung up, Agent Martinez called me immediately. Mrs. Thompson, that was perfect. Patricia took the bait completely. She's already made 3 phone calls since your conversation ended, presumably coordinating with other members of the network. Who has she been calling? One call was to Marcus Webb, one was to a number we haven't identified yet, and the third was to Diana in federal prison. We're monitoring all of those communications, so we'll know if they suspect this is a setup. The next day, I met Patricia at a small cafe in White Plains, the same type of quiet location where she'd originally lured me when pretending to be concerned about Diana's threats. But this time, I was wearing a wire and had federal agents positioned throughout the restaurant. Patricia looked exactly like she had during our previous meetings, concerned and sympathetic, playing the role of the worried sister perfectly. Margaret, I can't tell you how much it means to Diana to know you're reconsidering everything. I just keep thinking about Sophie and Michael, I said, sticking to my script. They've already lost their mother to prison. If I can help reduce her sentence by clarifying some things, shouldn't I do that? Patricia nodded enthusiastically. Exactly. And Margaret, between you and me, I think Diana's lawyer believes the charges can be reduced significantly if you're willing to testify that there was family agreement about the financial arrangements. What do you mean? Family agreement? Patricia leaned forward conspiratorially. Well, if you were to say that Thomas had discussed moving money through different accounts for tax purposes, and that Diana was just following family instructions rather than acting on her own, that would change everything. Patricia was coaching me to commit perjury to help Diana's defense. But more importantly, she was revealing that Diana's legal strategy involved lying about family authorization for her crimes. Patricia, I want to help, but I'm not sure I understand all the financial details well enough to know what to say. Don't worry about that. Diana's lawyer can prep you on exactly what testimony would be most helpful. The important thing is showing that Diana was acting as part of the family rather than against it. For the next hour, Patricia walked me through various scenarios where my testimony could be modified to help Diana's defense. She never directly asked me to lie, but every suggestion involved changing my account of events in ways that would create reasonable doubt about Diana's criminal intent. What Patricia didn't realize was that every word of our conversation was being recorded by federal agents, creating evidence of witness tampering and obstruction of justice. Margaret, there's one more thing, Patricia said as we were finishing lunch. Diana wanted me to ask you about your daily routine now that this whole situation has settled down. She's worried about you, wondering if you're taking proper care of yourself. The question made my blood run cold. Patricia was asking about my current routine the same way she'd been gathering intelligence before Diana's arrest. The criminal network was still monitoring me, still potentially viewing me as a target. My routine is pretty much the same as always, I said carefully. Morning walks, grocery shopping on Tuesdays, library volunteer work on Thursdays. Patricia nodded, and I could see her mentally cataloging the information. That's good, Margaret. Maintaining routine is important for mental health at our age. After we parted ways, I sat in my car for several minutes, trying to process what had just happened. Patricia had attempted to coach me into committing perjury, revealed Diana's legal defense strategy, and continued gathering intelligence about my daily activities. But the most disturbing realization was that Patricia genuinely seemed to believe Diana was innocent. Either she was an extremely good actress, or she'd convinced herself that her sister's crimes were justifiable or misunderstood. Agent Martinez called me 20 minutes after I got home. Mrs. Thompson, that meeting gave us exactly what we needed. Patricia Walsh has just committed federal crimes of witness tampering and obstruction of justice. More importantly, she's revealed the broader strategy of Diana's criminal network. What kind of broader strategy? Based on Patricia's phone calls after your meeting, the network is planning to continue operations while Diana's case is pending. They're using the delay in legal proceedings to target new victims, including Eleanor Chen. Eleanor Chen, who was probably going about her normal routine right now, unaware that Patricia Walsh and Marcus Webb were planning to destroy her life the same way they'd tried to destroy mine. Agent Martinez, when do we stop them? Soon, Mrs. Thompson. We're gathering evidence on the entire network now. Your cooperation has helped us understand how they operate and coordinate their crimes. As I hung up the phone, I realized that my role in this investigation was far from over. Patricia and her associates were still active, still dangerous, and still underestimating their victims. They were about to learn that sometimes the people you target fight back harder than you ever expected. 1 week after my lunch with Patricia, Agent Martinez called with news that changed everything we thought we knew about Diana's criminal network. What we'd uncovered was bigger and more sophisticated than anyone had imagined. Mrs. Thompson, we need you to come in immediately. We've arrested Marcus Webb, and what he's told us about the network's operations is going to shock you. At the FBI office, Agent Martinez and Agent Chen looked like they'd been working around the clock. The conference room was covered with charts, photographs, and documents that seemed to map out a criminal enterprise spanning multiple states and over a decade. Mrs. Thompson, Marcus Webb has agreed to cooperate in exchange for a reduced sentence. What he's revealed is that Diana's network isn't just a small group of criminals targeting random families. It's a sophisticated organization that specializes in elder fraud and has been operating for over 15 years. Agent Chen pulled out an organizational chart that looked like something from a corporate boardroom. The network has approximately 20 active members across 6 states. Diana was essentially a regional manager responsible for identifying and grooming targets in the northeastern region. A regional manager. Diana's crimes against our family weren't personal revenge or desperate financial schemes. They were part of a professional criminal organization that treated elder abuse like a business model. How many families has this network targeted? Agent Martinez consulted her notes. Based on Marcus Webb's information, we've identified potential victims in 43 cases over the past 15 years. Estimated losses exceed $12 million, and we suspect there may have been as many as 7 suspicious deaths of elderly victims. 7 suspicious deaths. Diana's plan to murder me wasn't unprecedented. It was part of a pattern that had been repeated multiple times across different states. Eleanor Morrison in Seattle wasn't Diana's first victim. She was part of a series. Agent Martinez, how does such a large criminal network operate without being detected? Agent Chen answered. The network specializes in targeting isolated elderly victims and uses sophisticated methods to make the crimes look like family financial arrangements or natural deaths. They move between states frequently and use false identities, making it difficult for local law enforcement to identify patterns. The FBI showed me photographs of other network members, people who looked like normal middle-aged adults you might encounter in any suburban community. The ordinariness of their appearances was chilling, making me realize how easy it would be for such criminals to blend into family situations. Mrs. Thompson, based on Marcus Webb's information, we now understand why Diana kept such detailed records of her crimes. She wasn't just documenting her activities for personal reference. She was reporting to network leadership and sharing techniques with other regional managers. That explained the meticulous surveillance photos and recorded conversations we'd found in Diana's safe. She hadn't been careless about preserving evidence. She'd been required to document her methods as part of the network's operational procedures. Agent Martinez, where does Patricia fit into this organization? Patricia Walsh has been a paid operative of the network for over 5 years. She specializes in befriending elderly targets and gathering intelligence about their financial situations and family relationships. Her role in your case wasn't unique. She's done the same thing to multiple families. 5 years. Patricia's friendship with Diana hadn't been sisterly loyalty. It had been a professional criminal relationship that predated Diana's marriage to Thomas. Everything about Patricia's involvement in our family had been calculated and false. Agent Chen showed me surveillance footage from other states, showing Patricia befriending elderly women in different communities. The techniques were identical to what she'd used with me, gradually increasing contact, asking detailed questions about daily routines and health, expressing concern about family financial management. How many other victims has Patricia helped target? Based on the evidence we've recovered, Patricia has been involved in at least 8 cases across 4 states. Her specialty is building trust relationships with elderly women who live alone. I thought about all the times Patricia had called to check on me over the past 2 years, how she'd gradually increased the frequency of contact and started asking more personal questions about my relationship with Thomas and my financial situation. Every conversation had been a professional intelligence gathering operation. Agent Martinez pulled out more documents. Mrs. Thompson, there's something else you need to know about this network. They don't just target random elderly people. They specifically research families with significant assets and identify the most vulnerable members. What do you mean? Your family was targeted because Thomas's business success made you a high-value victim, but also because your status as a widow living alone made you seem like an easy target. The network researches potential victims for months before making contact. Thomas's wealth had painted a target on our entire family, but my perceived vulnerability had made me the specific focus of their criminal plan. Diana's marriage to Thomas hadn't been romance or even simple revenge. It had been a professional assignment from a criminal organization. Agent Chen, is Eleanor Chen safe now that Marcus Webb has been arrested? Eleanor Chen is in protective custody, and we've disrupted the immediate threat to her safety. But Mrs. Thompson, we need your help to gather evidence against the remaining network members. More undercover work. The FBI wanted me to continue my role as a supposed ally of Diana's legal defense while secretly helping gather evidence against her criminal associates. What do you need me to do? Agent Martinez explained their plan. We want you to maintain contact with Patricia while she's out on bail, letting her believe you're still willing to help Diana's defense. Based on Marcus Webb's information, Patricia will likely try to introduce you to other network members who can help coordinate your testimony. The plan would put me in direct contact with professional criminals who specialized in murdering elderly people. The risk was significant, but so was the opportunity to prevent future victims from experiencing what had happened to me. Agent Martinez, if I do this, what guarantees do I have for my safety? We'll have surveillance teams monitoring all your interactions and will intervene at the first sign of any threat. But Mrs. Thompson, these people still see you as a confused elderly victim rather than a federal informant. That misconception is your best protection. As I left the FBI office, I realized that Diana's attempt to make me a victim had actually revealed my strength and resourcefulness. Instead of being destroyed by her crimes, I'd become instrumental in stopping a criminal network that had been victimizing families for over a decade. Patricia and her associates had made the fatal mistake of underestimating their intended victim. They were about to learn that some grandmothers fight back harder than they ever imagined possible. 2 weeks after Marcus Webb's arrest, Patricia contacted me with an urgent request that made my blood run cold. She wanted me to meet with someone she described as Diana's specialist attorney, but the location and timing she suggested immediately raised red flags. Margaret, this lawyer has experience with federal fraud cases involving family financial arrangements. He thinks he can get Diana's charges significantly reduced if you're willing to clarify your testimony. The meeting was scheduled for evening at a small office building in a relatively isolated part of Stamford. Agent Martinez had briefed me that legitimate attorneys don't typically meet potential witnesses in unmarked buildings after business hours. Mrs. Thompson, Agent Martinez said as she fitted me with recording equipment, we believe Patricia is leading you into a situation where network members plan to either intimidate you or eliminate you as a threat to their operations. Eliminate you. Even though I'd volunteered for this undercover work, hearing those words out loud made the danger feel suddenly real. These weren't desperate criminals acting impulsively. They were professionals who'd killed before when witnesses threatened their organization. Agent Martinez, are you certain you can protect me if something goes wrong? We have surveillance teams positioned around the building and agents ready to intervene immediately. But Mrs. Thompson, if at any point you feel unsafe, use the code phrase we practiced and we'll extract you immediately. The code phrase was, I need to call Thomas about the grandchildren. Simple enough to remember, innocuous enough not to arouse suspicion, clear enough for the surveillance team to recognize as an emergency signal. I arrived at the office building exactly on time, noting the FBI surveillance vehicles positioned discreetly around the area. Patricia was waiting in the lobby, looking more nervous than I'd ever seen her. Margaret, thank you so much for doing this. Diana's future depends on getting accurate testimony about the family financial arrangements. Patricia led me to a small office on the 3rd floor where 2 men were waiting. Neither of them looked like attorneys. They looked like the kind of people who solved problems through intimidation rather than legal arguments. Mrs. Thompson, I'm James Crawford, the older man said, extending his hand. I specialize in federal fraud defense, particularly cases involving family financial misunderstandings. James Crawford wasn't listed in any Bar Association database according to the FBI's pre-meeting research. He was almost certainly another network member posing as a legal professional. Patricia tells me you've reconsidered your testimony about Diana's activities, Crawford continued. I understand you now realize there may have been family authorization for the financial arrangements in question. Well, I've been thinking that maybe Thomas and I didn't communicate clearly about what Diana was authorized to do. Crawford nodded approvingly. Exactly. Family financial management can be complicated, especially when elderly family members might not remember all the conversations and agreements that were made. The second man, who'd introduced himself as Crawford's paralegal, was taking detailed notes. But something about his behavior suggested he was more interested in assessing my mental state and physical vulnerability than in documenting legal information. Mrs. Thompson, have you discussed your change of perspective with any federal agents or prosecutors? The question was clearly designed to determine whether I was working with law enforcement. No, I haven't talked to anyone official. I just started feeling guilty about Diana sitting in prison when this might all be a misunderstanding. Crawford smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. That's very wise, Mrs. Thompson. Sometimes it's better to resolve family matters quietly rather than involving law enforcement unnecessarily. For the next 30 minutes, Crawford walked me through various scenarios where my testimony could be modified to support Diana's defense. But gradually, the questions became more specific about my current living situation, daily routine, and whether anyone would notice if I were to disappear for several days. Mrs. Thompson, changing federal testimony is a serious matter. Sometimes witnesses need time away from family pressure to really think through what they want to say in court. Time away from family pressure. Crawford was suggesting that I might need to be isolated while I prepared my revised testimony, which sounded suspiciously like kidnapping disguised as witness preparation. I'm not sure I understand what you mean. The paralegal spoke up for the first time. Sometimes elderly witnesses benefit from staying in a quiet location where they can focus on their testimony without distractions from family members who might influence their memory of events. They were planning to take me to a secondary location, probably to coerce me into changing my testimony or to eliminate me as a threat to the network's operations. The realization made my heart rate spike, but I forced myself to maintain the confused grandmother act. That sounds very thoughtful, but I'm comfortable preparing at home. Crawford's expression hardened slightly. Mrs. Thompson, I don't think you understand how serious these federal charges are. Diana could spend the rest of her life in prison unless witnesses like you provide accurate testimony about family financial arrangements. The atmosphere in the room had shifted from professional to threatening. Crawford was no longer asking for my cooperation. He was demanding it in ways that suggested consequences for refusal. Mr. Crawford, I want to help Diana, but I'm not comfortable going anywhere else to prepare my testimony. The paralegal stood up and moved to a position that blocked my path to the door. Mrs. Thompson, we really think you should consider our suggestion about taking some time to prepare properly. They were no longer asking. They were preparing to force me to leave with them. It was time to use the emergency signal. I'm sorry, but I need to call Thomas about the grandchildren. Sophie has a school event tomorrow that I promised to attend. Within seconds, I could hear footsteps in the hallway outside the office. Agent Martinez and her team had been monitoring the conversation and recognized the code phrase immediately. The office door burst open as federal agents entered with weapons drawn. FBI! Nobody move! Crawford and his paralegal were on the ground in handcuffs before I fully processed what was happening. Patricia, who'd been sitting quietly throughout the meeting, started crying and claiming she had no idea that Crawford wasn't a legitimate attorney. But as Agent Martinez would explain to me later, Patricia's phone records showed extensive communications with both men over the past month. She'd been coordinating the plan to kidnap me from the beginning. The network's mistake had been underestimating their victim once again. They'd assumed I was a confused elderly woman who would be easily manipulated or intimidated. Instead, I'd helped the FBI identify and arrest additional network members while gathering evidence that would shut down their operations permanently. Diana's criminal organization was collapsing because they'd chosen the wrong grandmother to victimize. 6 months later, I stood in federal court watching the final chapter of Diana's criminal empire come to an end. The courtroom was packed with victims and their families, FBI agents, prosecutors and journalists, covering what had become known as the Northeast Elder Fraud Conspiracy. Diana sat at the defendant's table looking older and smaller than I remembered, wearing an orange jumpsuit that drained all color from her face. The 12 years she'd spent playing the role of devoted wife and mother seemed like a different lifetime now that everyone could see who she really was. Judge Patricia Williams reviewed the sentencing documents with an expression of barely contained disgust. Diana Walsh, Patricia Walsh, James Crawford, and 8 other members of your criminal network have systematically targeted elderly victims across multiple states for over 15 years. The crimes you've committed represent some of the most callous exploitation of vulnerable populations this court has ever seen. The final tally was staggering. 47 elderly victims across 6 states, over $14 million stolen, and evidence suggesting at least 9 suspicious deaths that were likely murders disguised as accidents or natural causes. Diana's network had been operating like a professional criminal organization, complete with regional managers, operational procedures, and specialized roles for different types of crimes. Diana Walsh, the court sentences you to life in prison without the possibility of parole for your role as a leader in this criminal conspiracy. Life without parole. Diana would never have another opportunity to target innocent families or plan elaborate revenge schemes. Her criminal career was over permanently. Patricia received 25 years for her role in the conspiracy. James Crawford and the other network members received sentences ranging from 15 to 30 years. The entire organization had been dismantled, with their assets seized to provide restitution to victims. But the most satisfying moment came when Dave Morrison took the witness stand to provide victim impact testimony about his family's experience with Diana's crimes. Your Honor, Diana Walsh didn't just steal money from my family 15 years ago. She destroyed my brother's marriage, drove my mother to an early death, and shattered our family's sense of trust and security. But her greatest mistake was targeting the Thompson family, because Margaret Thompson fought back in ways that Diana never expected. Dave looked directly at me in the courtroom gallery. Mrs. Thompson's courage in cooperating with federal investigators not only protected her own family, but helped solve crimes that had gone unsolved for over a decade. Because of her willingness to fight back, my mother's death has finally been properly investigated and ruled a homicide. Eleanor Morrison's death had been reclassified as murder based on evidence uncovered during the network investigation. Diana hadn't confessed to killing Dave's mother, but forensic evidence and witness testimony had proven that Eleanor's supposed heart attack had been caused by poisoning. Dave Morrison finally had justice for his family's destruction and closure about his mother's true cause of death. As the court session ended and Diana was led away in shackles, I found myself thinking about strength and resilience. Diana had spent 12 years thinking she was manipulating a vulnerable elderly woman who would be easy to victimize and discard. Instead, she'd awakened a fighter who helped bring down an entire criminal organization. Mrs. Thompson, Agent Martinez approached me as we left the courthouse. I wanted you to know that the FBI has received information about similar criminal networks operating in other regions. Your testimony and cooperation in this case has provided a blueprint for investigating elder fraud conspiracies nationwide. My experience as Diana's intended victim had become a resource for protecting other families from similar crimes. The strength I'd discovered in fighting back against Diana was now helping elderly people across the country who were facing the same types of threats. Thomas and the grandchildren were waiting for me outside the courthouse. Sophie, now in her first year of college, hugged me tightly. "Grandma Margaret, I'm so proud of you for fighting back against Mom. You showed me what real courage looks like. Real courage." For most of my 68 years, I'd thought courage was about enduring difficulties quietly and maintaining family harmony at personal cost. Diana's crimes had taught me that sometimes courage means fighting back against people who hurt you, even when those people are family. Sophie, the most important thing I learned is that being family doesn't mean accepting abuse or criminal behavior. Real love sometimes requires holding people accountable for their actions. Michael, now 17 and preparing for his senior year, had grown up significantly during the months of legal proceedings. "Grandma, do you think Mom can ever change and become a better person?" It was a question I'd wrestled with throughout the investigation and trial. Diana had committed terrible crimes, but she was still their mother, and they deserved an honest answer about whether redemption was possible. "Michael, I think your mother is capable of understanding right from wrong, but she chooses to do wrong when it benefits her. That's not something that changes easily, especially after so many years of hurting people." As we walked toward our cars, I realized that Diana's story was finally over, but our family's story of recovery and healing was just beginning. Thomas was rebuilding his business with Dave Morrison, creating something clean and honest that couldn't be corrupted by criminal associates. Sophie and Michael were learning that integrity matters more than financial success, and that standing up for what's right is more important than maintaining family loyalty to people who don't deserve it. But the most important lesson was one I'd learned about myself. At 68 years old, I'd discovered that I was stronger, braver, and more resilient than I'd ever imagined possible. Diana Walsh had tried to make me a victim. Instead, she'd created an adversary who helped destroy her entire criminal empire. 6 months later, I received a letter from Eleanor Chen, the elderly woman whose life had been saved by our investigation of Diana's network. She'd written to thank me for preventing her from becoming another victim of the criminal organization. "Mrs. Thompson, I'll never know how close I came to losing everything I've worked for my entire life. Your courage in fighting back against these criminals saved not just your own family, but mine as well." Eleanor's letter reminded me that the consequences of Diana's crimes extended far beyond our family. By fighting back instead of accepting victimization, I'd helped protect other families from experiencing the same trauma. That knowledge was worth more than all the money Diana had ever stolen, and more satisfying than any revenge could have been. Diana had underestimated her victim, and it had cost her everything. Some grandmothers, it turns out, are not as harmless as they appear. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.